So for me, this whole project started, and I should mention I've never created a comic book or even thought about creating a comic book until I started this project, and which started for me back in December 2012. As some of you remember, there was worldwide news. There was this horrible gang rape that happened on a bus in New Delhi, and it just got phenomenal news. And I was in Delhi at that time, and I was involved in all these protests that were happening in the city and then eventually all over India in response to the indifference the government and what a lot of people showed to the woman who was raped, who eventually died from the horrible wounds. And at one of these rallies, I spoke to this Delhi police officer and asked him what he thought about what happened to her and what was happening around him. And he said something that really got me thinking and really gave me a perspective on sexual violence in India and around the world. He said, "No good girl walks home alone at night," implying that she either deserved it or she provoked the rape. So I knew the problem of sexual violence was not a legal problem, but a cultural problem. So I began this long journey of almost a year trying to understand and research this issue. And I spoke with many people, spoke with NGOs, philosophers, writers, eventually with rape survivors in India. And many of them kept telling me that the shame was always put on them, that they had trouble getting justice, they had trouble getting for people to believe in them. And as a result, this created this kind of vicious circle where certain rapists felt like they could get away with it because the fact that no one would listen to the women. And this led me to think about how, as an artist, as a filmmaker, that I could address this, and as a human being. And I started looking at, well, here's the problem of gender violence in India. Over 34,000 reported rapes in India, but only 21% of them actually go to trial. So you can imagine many more are not even reported. So as I said, I started talking, I started looking at all these different kind of mediums as an artist, how I could address this, and more particularly, how I could reach young people, and particularly young men, teenagers. And because I always felt teenagers were like at a critical age, especially teenage boys, when they're learning about gender violence, women, just sexuality, relationships, and everything else. And I knew as a child, as growing up in India, one of the most popular things that I did was I used to read comic books, especially Hindu mythological comic books. In India, comics of those sorts were enormously popular, selling in the hundreds of millions of copies all over India. And one of the critical things about these comic books is they incorporated Hindu mythology and Hindu storytelling into the elements. And one of the critical things about Hinduism that I wanted to incorporate into my series is this idea of conquering your fears. You know, Hinduism is, and I emphasize this to everyone, my comic book is not to promote Hinduism, but to use the core values, the philosophy of Hinduism, which you need to do, especially in India, which has an enormous Hindu population. So I took those values, and especially this idea that in these mythological stories, that often a villager would call upon the gods for help. And I incorporated that into my story, where my main character is just a regular woman, a villager, who goes through this horrific rape, and she calls upon the Hindu gods for help. But in my story, she realizes that the Hindu gods are actually causing more problems than helping her out, and she realizes it's really up to her to deal with this ordeal. So the comic book you can download for free and you can read it, but the key element is at the very end, where she's been thrown out of her community and she's living in the jungle in isolation, and she's being stalked by this tiger. And she climbs down this tree and looks the tiger in the eye and speaks this very powerful mantra, and basically turns the tiger, which is a metaphor for fear, into power, or Shakti. And she rides that tiger back into town, the town where the people threw her out, And obviously everyone's scared because they've never seen a woman riding a tiger into town. But she quickly transforms them through this mantra into addressing sexual violence and transforming their opinions towards women.